It's December. Thanksgiving already feels like a distant memory. The team has gotten through their biggest sale of the year, and now has their sights set on the last 4 weeks of 2023. Hametsu development has slowed down a bit while people take time off and relax. But with the clock ticking closer to the new year, the team has to focus on juggling both playtesting and creative development.
So how's it going? Have you had any roadblocks and/or challenges within the past couple weeks?
So it's coming good. With Thanksgiving just happening and the big Black Friday sale that we did, it's really like, I feel like I haven't done as much. Realistically, when you're spending time with family and doing all that kind of stuff. This week, going forward, we're really gonna get down and start grinding the play testing, so that hopefully by the time I'm through with that, Ben is through with the bulk of the creative process, and we can kind of meet at the end of that at the same time with enough time for us to start on layout.
As they look back on this past year and the projects that came with it, they are focused on wrapping up the most recent backroom event, Yasiga. Yasiga is a dice-less skirmish game, written by Corey Sullivan, and was released for pre-order in July of this year.
These are the first hardcover books that we've done. Hardcover books are a whole new ballgame compared to softcover books. They are a lot heavier. You have to actually freight them. The numbers that we ordered were also much higher than things that we've ordered in the past. So as we're wrapping up the Yasiga and we're preparing for Hametsu, that is something that is very much on our minds. It's a whole new process. Ben, I think, mentioned it in the previous video about offset printing, your big boy professional printing stuff. And while we got lucky, I would say, the first time, as well as Ben putting in his due diligence, it is a process that experience can trump any reading online. So we've got one under our belt, and going into the second one, we're hoping we can pull off something with the same results.
Yasiga brought some exciting new challenges for the design team. The dynamics of offset printing in China, as well as the realities of producing a new type of printed product, meant that they saw some delays for the first time in a backroom launch.
Delays are never easy. These projects are getting more and more complicated as we produce new games and as we kind of seek to make the product range better. Yasiga was the first hardback book that we did, and I think that there was a lot of new aspects to this project that we really took on and kind of grabbed with both hands and ran with. I would say in like a general sense, it's always really smart to reflect back on your previous project when you're moving into a new one. Always take on customer feedback, as even if it's the feedback you don't want to hear, it's vitally important. If you're just looking at positive feedback in an echo chamber, you will never improve. And as we move into Hametsu, I think reflecting back on that is going to be really key for us.
While they wrap up this previous project, the team is hard at work pushing Hametsu forward.
We're hoping to launch Hametsu as a backroom event at the end of January, if not before. Probably have to push it to the end of January. We have done a backroom event now for Don't Look Back, Violent Dark, Lunar, and Yasiga, and all have done well. We specifically are doing backrooms and not Kickstarters because things like this do require cash up front, but we really dislike the Kickstarter business model. that companies have fallen into. The Backroom event allows us to order things in large quantities without having to use a Kickstarter platform. Without giving Kickstarter a cut, we end up with more control over the product, and it ends up just working out better for us and the customer. Things like books, our promise is that you get the product if you buy it, even if only 4 people had bought the book, but that would mean that those 4 books are incredibly expensive. And those numbers really don't start trailing off and becoming more profitable until you're dealing with 10,000 copies of a book or a run of 20,000. They start getting pretty absurd. So we run Backroom events to help offset that initial purchasing cost of things like hardcover books and setup costs for normal products. That said, we're very fortunate to have the cash flow where we can run MDF buildings, we can run resin products, we can do all that normal production and work it into our production queue without any major issues or risk of sinking the company.
Creating a tabletop game is never an easy or speedy task. Many hours are spent refining and curating the core rules into a playable shape. We asked the writer of Yasiga, Corey Sullivan, what it was like to publish a project for the first time.
The first thing I would recommend for new authors, and this is something I had to learn on the fly, was to manage expectations. Not necessarily in relationship with the author and the publisher. In our case, it's our relationship, but more with what you expect out of your project. Having a clear goal of what you want your project to accomplish, like a clear statement, and following that statement through was key. There's a temptation to really throw the kitchen sink into it and throw everything you've ever wanted to see in a game into a single project. When the pandemic rolled around and I needed a creative outlet that would consume a lot of time in one pass, and so I took a couple different outlines that I had and made them all mesh. Yasiga was the culmination of I wrote games for fun. I worked at an LGS in the mid 2010s when I was in college, and I tend to have a tendency to create what I consume. I do music on the side, I do a bunch of things, and when I started really getting into tabletop games, board games, card games, etc., there was a sense of I want to make something that I don't see yet. And throughout that time, there were a lot of these disparate little projects that would only be half finished, or I'd write out little outlines and just let them sit for a while.
We asked him if there was anything he'd do differently if he could do the project all over again.
If you ask me in a year's time, I will probably have a much better answer, and I'll probably say yeah, no dice was a bad idea, or something along those lines. I don't have any regrets as far as the project is concerned. It was such a great experience bringing it to fruition through and through.
We've really been working on trying to balance the higher level characters with higher level bosses and higher level Oni. Some of them we've had to tune down quite a bit. Some of them we've had to tune up a little bit. We've made some small changes to some of the different classes as far as their abilities go. We're trying to make sure that everything fits as well together as it can when you build out, teams of 4, so to say. But there have been some changes to the way engaging and disengaging works. Previously, that wasn't really an issue that I covered in the game. We didn't. In most games, you have to make an action to disengage from something. After some balancing stuff with higher level characters, I think it needs to be in the game. and it's a fun ability to give certain characters, and they don't have to worry about using disengage actions. But for me to buff some characters that way, I have to nerf everybody by saying, if you don't have these abilities, you have to use an action to disengage. I really encourage people, if they're interested in building super focused, high-powered characters, you're going to be able to do it in this game. And there will be level 8 characters. If you have a group of 4 max level characters, there will be those combos that will completely wipe the table. That it's going to be a part of the game. And I want people to be able to do that. I want the characters to feel powerful. I want people to be able to make broken combos. I think that's fun. The people who don't want to min-max their characters don't feel underpowered, right? The problem is if you balance to the highest common denominator, everything else under that feels underpowered. Most of the culling we've already done up to this point. As an example of some of the things that I've cut, there are 3 character classes that aren't making it into the core rulebook. There's just not room for them at this point. There are at least 5 or 6 more boss designs that I wanted to do that didn't make it into the core rules either, just because I needed the widest variety of bosses and the widest play style of bosses in the core rules, and the ones that I've cut played a little too closely to each other. I would like to be able to have almost a 5 or 6 game campaign set up that plays specifically for some of these bosses. It's not something I have time to do right now, but in the future, who knows? Maybe we can do that.
The rules aren't the only thing getting polish and attention. Ben has been burning some long, late-night hours to get the bulk of the art direction work wrapped up. He's even started sculpting a couple of miniatures.
There's something really interesting about combining historical and fantasy elements. It's kind of like a little bit with what we did with Luna, where it's alt history. You could say there's an element of fantasy to that, really. And I think that taking samurais and those types of historical Japanese warriors and putting them in a situation where they're fighting fantasy monsters is pretty cool. And to me, the image that sums it up is, a lone warrior with his sword out against a huge hulking monster with water dripping off it and trees coming out of it. And, it's like that image to me, I'm like, I want to play that game. I want to experience that on the tabletop. Sculpting is really interesting. I'm not a traditional sculptor by any means. I came to sculpting out of necessity. A lot of people ask me, do you feel like an artist? Do you feel like a sculptor? And I don't, actually. What I'm designing is a product, right? The process that I'm using is digital sculpting. But for me, the focus is always on the end product. People will do with that product, which is they'll take the miniature and they'll paint it and they'll game with it, right? So it has utility. Really consider the production aspect of it in terms of can this item be cast? Can it be taken out of the packaging and cleaned and primed and painted by a person? You have to consider all those things when you're making them. And I think it's one of those things that I do enjoy about the process, but it can be really challenging sometimes. One of the challenges I'm finding with Hametsu is that it's both a historical game and a fantasy game. You have to stay true to history, but at the same time, you have to make something that's creatively interesting. Original, I guess you could say. And I think I'm trying an approach at the moment. We'll see if it works, of blending historical elements with stuff that's more conceptual. Things may change as the project evolves. It may become more of a historical game, or it may become more fantastical. Right now, we're so early in the process that we're still trying to figure a lot of that stuff out. But it felt like the right time to start to put things into sculpted form. Sculpting for Hametsu is, I think, going to be challenging because it's quite a lot of sculpting to do. And we're still wrestling with the idea of releasing the miniatures digitally only. We don't want to put so much of an emphasis on the miniatures for this project. We want to make sure that we can elevate the book. Hopefully we'll meet that challenge, but it kind of remains to be seen, I think.
With the Christmas break fast approaching, with an already packed manufacturing schedule, can the team get the first phase of Hametsu completed before the new year? This is going to be the perfect test of how far they've crafted their skills of publishing games.